Hey, Cypher here with Diatribe number 4. So a question I get on the channel a lot are things like, why do you call yourself Cypher? Why do you call the channel the Cynical Historian? Things along those lines. And then I also have people who are trying to claim that I'm on one side of the political spectrum or the other, or they're just simply asking me. So today I thought I would talk about the values that I'm hoping to espouse through this channel. And, what makes the cynical historian cynical. So first off, I've got to say, I've actually made a couple of videos along these lines already, one being a guide to cynicism, the other one being an etymology of the word cipher. But both of those were more about cynicism itself, or about the etymology of the word cipher itself, rather than why I took on those words. So let's begin with the word cipher. It's actually a handle I used to use when I was a little kid, and I just kept on using it. It does have some significance for me personally, since, it is kind of signifying that I'm encoding myself, because ultimately, what I'm presenting on this channel is not about me, it's about the things I'm presenting, as any good scholar should do. But I also want to maintain a bit of academic distance. And I've said it on the channel before, I'm keeping the pseudonym for academic and familial reasons. I want my scholarship outside of this channel to stand on its own, and I want the channel itself to stand on its own. So then why do I call the channel Cynical Historian? Well, the historian bit's pretty obvious, I think, but what's up with that whole cynical bit? If you go back to that video on cynicism, you'll see that there are 5 virtues that comprise the basis of cynicism. The first being life in accordance with nature. I'm using electronics and I'm not living like a bum, so obviously I'm not doing that. But there's a more important underlying virtue, which is to be happiest with the least, which is somewhat of YouTube's aesthetic. To try to cut things down as much as possible. But yeah, ultimately that part of cynicism doesn't really apply. But the next one does, philanthropia. As in to espouse your philosophy as much as possible. Diogenes would famously go out into the market trying to find a real human being, and do all kinds of crazy stuff to show what he meant by a real human being. And the symbol for the channel is a lantern, just like he would carry a lantern into the market. Also, the other part of that lantern is that it's in the shape of a 0, as in cipher. Cynical Cypher, which was the original name of the channel. Which is also why I call this the Diatribe. The word diatribe is actually a creation of the Cynics, and it basically means to lecture. But it also has come to mean kind of ranting, but not really, it's more like a fierce criticism. So that's why I call this segment the Diatribe. And in terms of espousing your own philosophy as much as possible, I'll get to it later, but there are 2 things that I try to espouse the most, which is nuance and ambiguity. I may not be so good at not being judgmental, but I can certainly use nuance and ambiguity to offset my own judgment. So the next cynical virtue is to deface the coinage. Of course, you can take that literally, and obviously I'm not going around and cutting up $1 bills and all that. But instead, deface the coinage can more mean deface the culture, or don't take the culture for granted, or don't believe in customs. Because the original Greek was kind of a pun. It was parateretetian tu nomisma, but it sounds a little bit like parateretetian tu nomos. And so how that applies to the channel is that I am quite willing to go against cultural norms. I'm quite willing to deface them, so long as it's in service of gaining a better understanding of history itself. So there's a lot of things that I've said on this channel that I'll have people commenting like, you gotta have a lot of balls to say that kind of crap. And my reaction is like, well, thanks. Even though they're trying to say like, how dare you say something so bad. So long as it's in service of the truth, I don't think it can be bad. So the next cynical virtue is shamelessness. As in, when you're like defacing the culture, as in the previous virtue, you have no shame in doing so. By its very definition, you have to be bold to be shameless. You have to not kowtow or be apologetic for something that you're not actually apologetic for. So I think how that applies is pretty obvious. The next one is Cosmopolitanism. And this is the one virtue I've got to work on the most, because I am an American historian, so I tend to focus on American history. Also, in the early years, I didn't really think I had an international audience, so I thought I was just speaking to Americans, so a lot of the time I made those episodes without that international audience in mind. I am working at getting better at that, but I think I have a long ways to go. But if I am giving a specifically American perspective, then now I try to at least say why it's important to people who aren't in America. So yeah, that's the 5 cynical virtues and how it applies to the channel. But to put it in much simpler terms, being a cynical historian means that I'm out there searching the marketplace to find a real human being. But in this case, the real human being is just a better understanding of the past. And I'm perfectly willing to call out those who disguise that path, as in the entire Based on a True Story series. So let's get into how I present these things and the tools that I use, specifically nuance and ambiguity, to try to usurp my own inherent judgment. So in short videos, it's pretty hard to get into every nuance and present every ambiguity. But I do always try to use special linguistic tricks to imply those things. So instead of saying, this was the first time this happened, I'll say, this is one of the first times this happened. Or instead of saying it happened 103 years ago, I say a century. Because if you give century or decade rather than the actual number, it implies a bit of ambiguity. So I'm always trying to add that to my scripts, that there's some sort of implied ambiguity, and the nuances are out there if you want to go and find them. But I'm also trying my darndest to not take a side. Now, I think it's kind of silly a lot of the time when people are talking about sides of history, but the most basic way of seeing it is whether or not you denounce something or affirm another thing. You know, demonization or glorification. So when I'm going after movies, oftentimes I'm focusing very much on whether or not they're demonizing or glorifying. But that's when they're speaking falsehoods. In history, you don't get to speak falsehoods. So when I say that I'm trying to avoid glorification and demonization, it means something kind of different from what Hollywood does, because they're just perfectly fine with lying. They think history is some sort of abstract entity that they could just warp to their own means. But for me, you'll see a lot of these videos where I'm talking about pretty bad subjects such as genocide. But instead of trying to tell the story like there's a good guy and a bad guy, you just try to avoid saying anything that would imply that kind of judgment. Now, there's a further layer to that where I study violence, and that's pretty much to say that violence is bad, obviously. But I don't just outright say that. I try to describe rather than judge. And that's the whole nuance and ambiguity thing. Now, who I am definitely allowed to be judgmental of are other historians, or people trying to do history, as in, Hollywood producers, or anybody making statements about history that are patently false. That I get to be judgmental about because that is my profession, not history itself. Eventually it'll be history, and in a lot of cases it already is. Say, Wilson. Because obviously I have a vehement hate for Woodrow Wilson, but I get to because he was a historian. So historians or people making statements about history or trying to do something in the history profession in any way are fair game for judgment. So to get to the last question that I get a lot in terms of these things is, what is my political position? I'm not going to get as explicit as saying who I voted for, but I will say what political positions I held in the past and how I have kind of swung all over the place. So when I was in high school, as the song goes, I was a teenage anarchist looking for a revolution. Hell, when I joined the army, I went to basic training with an entire compendium of Emma Goldman in my backpack. But I also left by leaving that compendium on the drill sergeant's desk. We weren't allowed to read anything other than the Bible, so the stuff in that backpack was sitting in a locker pretty much the entire time I was in basic, but we were able to go and grab those things when we were leaving, and so as some sort of grandiose gesture, I left it on the drill sergeant's desk. I have to wonder what his reaction was, but I was out of there before I could get reprimanded. But after that, I experienced a swing far to the right. I became very much a Republican. Being in the army kind of does that to you. You start to espouse that whole thing of, this is my country, love it or leave it. And when I got out of the army, I did another turn way over to being a full-on hippie. I mean, I grew out my beard, had long hair. In fact, if you go to some of the earlier videos, you'll see I used to have long hair, though I was trimming my beard by the time that I started the channel. And not only with looks did I go full hippie, I definitely swung into that political camp too. But all of these things were kind of phases. I'd like to think myself more as a centrist. And a lot of the time, if people are calling me a libtard or a Nazi, that more shows their political ideology than my own. Because, if you couldn't tell, my actual political ideology is all kinds of congested. You could easily call me a libertarian. I could see that applying. But then there's also a lot of socialistic things that I would advocate for, which would seem to be, opposing ideologies. But I more take these things on a case-by-case basis. Well, I have no problem denouncing Donald Trump and a lot of his bases, as in the alt-right. I also have no problem denouncing a lot of the left as well. But ultimately, my own personal politics shouldn't matter. It should be about what I am presenting on this channel. Whether or not there's some sort of political bias behind it, doesn't really matter. I don't know if there's political bias behind it, because I kinda don't know my own political bias. It's pretty dang hard to define. But ultimately, what I hope that I am espousing is trying to get a better historical understanding of the world. And yeah, that's inherently political. But it's not necessarily part of any side of the political spectrum, because in history, there are no sides. There are only people. So hopefully that clarifies this for some folks. And if you have any further questions, you can always ask me in the comments. I'll see you guys next time.